He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. At the Christmas table in Scottsdale, Arizona, my stepfather simply placed his hand on the back of my chair and said, "That seat isn't for you." The room went quiet, not shocked quiet, comfortable quiet. My name is Natalie Pierce. I was 30 years old that Christmas night. And in that moment, I understood something I had spent 10 years avoiding. He hadn't just taken my seat, he had taken my inheritance, my voice, and my silence, because he believed I would keep it. What Lawrence Pierce didn't know was that silence isn't empty. It stores things. And on that night, at a table where no one defended me, everything he'd taken finally began to come back. I didn't argue with him, not because I agreed, but because I understood the rules of that room. At the table in Scottsdale, Christmas dinner continued as if nothing had shifted. Silverware touched plates. Someone asked about dessert. The sound of ice settling in a glass carried farther than it should have. I stood there for a moment, my chair still warm behind me, and waited to see if anyone would notice the empty space. No one did. My stepfather, Lawrence Pierce, withdrew his hand from the chair as if he'd merely adjusted it. He didn't look at me again. He didn't need to. He'd already made his point, to me and to everyone else watching closely enough to understand. My mother, Elaine Pierce, sat with her hands folded at the far end of the table. She didn't speak. Her eyes stayed fixed on the centerpiece, a low arrangement of winter branches and white candles. I knew that look. It was the one she wore when choosing silence felt safer than choosing sides. Across from her, Brianna leaned back in her chair, scrolling on her phone beneath the table. She didn't look up either. She never had to. This house had been arranged around her comfort for years. I stepped away from the table. "I'm going to get some air," I said. No one stopped me. Outside, the desert night was cool and still, the kind of quiet that feels intentional. The lights around the pool glowed softly, reflecting off water that never moved. From the patio, I could still hear voices inside, muffled laughter, familiar rhythms, already absorbing the moment, smoothing it into something forgettable. I leaned against the railing and breathed. This wasn't new. Lawrence had been editing me out of the room for a long time. When my father, Michael Pierce, died, Lawrence didn't rush into control. He waited. He framed himself as support, as stability, as someone who could handle things, while my mother adjusted. He spoke in calm sentences and long explanations, the kind that made resistance feel unnecessary. At first I was grateful. Then I became invisible. Small decisions were made without me, then larger ones. Conversations shifted rooms when I entered. Lawrence referred to the family business, my father's supply company in Tempe, as something I wouldn't need to worry about. "Too much stress," he said once, smiling. "Let's keep you focused on your own life." So I did. I worked. I saved. I learned to build independence quietly. I told myself that distance was maturity, that not needing anything was strength. I didn't notice when that distance became exclusion. On the patio, I watched my breath disappear into the night air and realized how carefully he'd shaped the environment around me. Not with cruelty, with convenience. Inside, Lawrence raised his glass. I caught a glimpse through the window, him speaking, others nodding. He looked comfortable, certain. I knew that posture, too. It belonged to someone who believed the structure would hold no matter what weight he put on it. I went back inside only long enough to collect my coat. My mother finally looked at me then. "Natalie," she said softly. I waited. "We'll talk later." I nodded. Later had become our favorite word. In the hallway, I passed the framed photos, family vacations, holidays, moments carefully curated. My father's face appeared less often as the years went on, his presence fading into the background of newer arrangements. I stopped in front of one photo from long ago. My father standing in the warehouse, hands in his pockets, smiling at something just out of frame. He'd never liked posed pictures. He preferred moments that weren't trying to prove anything. Outside, I walked to my car and sat there without starting the engine. The house behind me glowed warm and settled, unchanged by what had just happened. In the trunk, beneath a stack of folded blankets and an old box I hadn't opened in months, sat something I hadn't thought about all evening. My father's documents. I'd taken them from a storage unit years ago when Lawrence suggested clearing things out. I hadn't argued then either. I'd simply kept what felt important and stored it away, telling myself I'd sort through it someday. Someday had arrived quietly. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and thought about the chair again. Not the loss of it, but the ease with which it had been taken. How natural it had seemed to everyone else. Lawrence believed seats were assigned by authority. My father had believed they were earned by care. I started the engine. As I pulled away, the house receded into the darkness, its lights steady and unconcerned. Inside, Christmas dinner would end the way it always did, with polite goodbyes and practiced warmth. Lawrence would believe the moment had passed. He wouldn't realize it hadn't ended. It had clarified. And somewhere between the desert quiet and the open road, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to name before. Silence doesn't mean absence. Sometimes it means everything is being gathered, slowly, carefully, waiting for the right moment to return. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove without direction through the quiet streets of Scottsdale, letting the city thin out until the lights grew sparse and the night felt wider. My thoughts stayed with the house behind me, the way the room had accepted my absence without disruption, the way silence had folded neatly over the moment. At a red light, I rested my forehead briefly against the steering wheel. This was what erasure looked like. Not loud, not cruel, just efficient. When I finally reached my apartment, it was nearly midnight. I carried the box from my trunk inside and set it on the kitchen table without opening it. The cardboard was worn, edges softened by time. I'd labeled it years ago with a marker that had faded to gray, Dad's papers. I made tea I didn't drink and sat across from the box, hands folded, waiting for a feeling that didn't arrive. Eventually, I opened it. Inside were folders arranged with my father's familiar care. Bills, contracts, handwritten notes clipped together with paper clips he reused until they bent. Nothing dramatic, nothing secretive, just the record of a man who believed details mattered. One folder sat apart from the rest, estate planning. I paused, then opened it. There were documents I recognized, older versions of wills, correspondence with an attorney in Phoenix, notes about beneficiary designations. I'd seen some of this during probate, filtered through Lawrence's explanations. He'd assured us everything was handled properly, efficiently, with no need to revisit decisions already made. I believed him then. Now, reading my father's handwriting, something felt off. Not missing pages, misplaced ones. I spread the documents across the table and began sorting by date. Earlier papers were consistent, clear, protective. Later ones shifted in tone, language becoming more general, more flexible. The kind of flexibility that benefits whoever is holding the pen. I found an email printed and folded twice. If anything changes, notify Natalie directly. The sentence was underlined. My stomach tightened. I searched for attachments referenced in the email. They weren't there. Instead, there was a gap, a stretch of time where records thinned, explanations shortened, signatures appeared that didn't match my father's usual style. I opened my laptop and began cross-checking public records, property transfers, trust filings, corporate registrations tied to the family supply company in Tempe. The pattern was subtle. Assets didn't disappear. They migrated. Ownership shifted from protected structures into simpler ones, temporary adjustments that never reversed, decisions justified as efficiency. Lawrence's efficiency. By 2 a.m., my kitchen table was covered in papers arranged into 2 stacks, before and after. The line between them was thin, but unmistakable. This wasn't a mistake. It was a quiet rewrite. My phone buzzed. A message from Brianna. Dad says you left upset. He didn't mean anything by it. I didn't respond. I thought of the way Lawrence's hand had rested on the back of my chair. Light, practiced, unquestioned. The way he'd spoken without raising his voice, trusting the room to agree for him. Meaning isn't always loud. Sometimes it's rehearsed. I found another envelope at the bottom of the box, addressed to me in my father's handwriting but never opened. The seal had yellowed with age. Inside was a letter. Not formal, not legal, just his words. Natalie, it began, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain everything myself. He wrote about caution, about patience, about how people who seek control often rely on others being tired, distracted, or polite. Don't rush, he advised, and don't confront without clarity. Structures exist for a reason. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the documents. Outside, the night had deepened. The city felt suspended, as if waiting. I backed up every file I'd scanned and created a simple list. Dates, names, changes, nothing interpretive, just facts aligned in sequence. By the time the sky began to lighten, I understood what the chair at Christmas had really represented. It wasn't about where I sat. It was about who had been deciding things without me for years. Lawrence believed I wouldn't look back, that I'd accept what was presented and move on quietly. He didn't know I'd inherited my father's patience. I closed the box not to hide it, but to contain it. There was no urgency yet, no confrontation waiting to happen, just preparation. As the sun rose, I realized something else. This story wasn't going to be corrected with words. It would be corrected with order. I didn't confront Lawrence, not because I was afraid of him, but because I was learning how he moved. The days after Christmas settled into something that looked ordinary from the outside. Lawrence sent a group message thanking everyone for coming. Brianna posted photos from the dinner, cropped carefully to exclude the space where I'd stood. My mother called once, her voice tentative, asking if I'd gotten home safely. I said yes. Ordinary is useful when you're watching. Each morning before work, I returned to the documents. I didn't read them all at once. I read them the way my father would have, slowly with breaks letting inconsistencies surface on their own. I made a simple spreadsheet and logged changes without commentary. Dates, entities, amounts, signatures. Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves when you stop interrupting them. The first pattern was timing. Transfers clustered around moments of vulnerability. My father's hospitalization, the weeks after his death, the period when my mother relied most heavily on Lawrence to handle things. Nothing dramatic, just steady movement while attention was elsewhere. The second pattern was structure. Assets didn't vanish. They were repositioned, trusts simplified, safeguards removed under the language of efficiency, control consolidated into fewer hands, then quietly renamed as stewardship. Lawrence's favorite word. On Wednesday, I drove past the supply company in Tempe for the first time in months. I didn't go in. I parked across the street and watched trucks come and go, the operation running smoothly on the surface. Employees moved with purpose, not urgency, the kind of rhythm that suggests systems doing what they were built to do. My father's systems. I noticed something else, too. A new sign on the building, temporary but professionally printed, listing a different entity name beneath the original. A subsidiary, perhaps, or something meant to look like one. I wrote it down. That afternoon, I pulled public filings and found the entity registered 18 months earlier. The timing aligned perfectly with a document I'd flagged at my kitchen table, a transfer justified as administrative. Administrative is another word people use when they don't want to explain something twice. On Friday, Lawrence called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was calm, friendly. He asked if we could have lunch, just the two of us. He said he wanted to clear the air. He said he missed our conversations. I listened once, then archived it. Clearing the air is what people suggest when they think they can still control the weather. That weekend, my grandmother came by. She moved slowly now, her steps careful but deliberate. She sat at the table and watched me organize papers without asking questions. When I finally paused, she reached into her bag and placed a small folder beside mine. I found these while cleaning, she said. Your father asked me to keep copies, just in case. Inside were bank statements and notes written in a tight hand I recognized instantly. My father's. The dates matched the gaps I'd noticed earlier. I looked up at her. She nodded. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. On Monday morning, I sent my first email. Not to Lawrence, not to my mother, to a compliance address listed on a regulatory website. I didn't accuse. I asked questions. I attached documents and asked whether the changes I'd identified aligned with standard governance practices following a death and leadership transition. I asked what documentation would typically be required to justify them. I hit send and closed my laptop. No drama, no escalation. Just inquiry. The response didn't come immediately. That was fine. Lawrence sent another message that evening, this time through my mother. "He's worried about you," she said. "He thinks you're holding on to anger." I thought about the chair again, the quiet way it had been taken, the way no one had objected. "I'm holding on to records," I replied. She didn't press. By Thursday, the reply arrived. It was brief and professional. It thanked me for reaching out and asked for additional documentation to provide accurate guidance. It included a list. The list was long. I smiled for the first time in days, because the list wasn't about me. It was about process. That night, I backed everything up twice and labeled a new folder sequence, the same word my father had used. I didn't feel angry. I felt aligned. Lawrence believed silence meant compliance, that politeness meant surrender, that people didn't look too closely if they were comfortable enough. He hadn't understood that I'd spent years learning how to be patient without disappearing. And now, with each document aligned and each question answered carefully, the structure he'd relied on was beginning to feel less solid, not collapsing, just visible. And visibility, once it arrives, doesn't need permission to stay. The reply from the compliance office changed the rhythm of everything. It didn't accuse. It didn't warn. It asked. They wanted clarification on specific dates, copies of amended filings, documentation supporting the restructuring of assets following my father's death. They asked who had authorized the changes and under what authority. Questions are dangerous when the answers are thin. I didn't respond immediately. I gathered. For the next 3 days, I worked methodically. I scanned, labeled, cross-referenced. I compared what existed publicly with what had been represented privately. Where explanations had been offered verbally, I looked for paper. Where signatures appeared, I compared them to originals. My father's handwriting was consistent. Lawrence's edits were not. On Tuesday morning, I returned to the building in Tempe, this time walking inside. The receptionist recognized me, hesitated for half a second, then smiled politely. I signed in as a visitor. I didn't ask for Lawrence. I asked for access to archived records. The clerk checked her screen, frowned slightly, then nodded. "Someone's already requested some of these," she said, "but I can get you copies." "Thank you," I replied. Someone else was asking questions now. By noon, my phone buzzed. Lawrence. I let it ring. He left a message, calm but sharpened at the edges. "Natalie, people are contacting the company asking things I don't understand. If you're involved, we need to talk." I saved it. That afternoon, I sent a second email to the compliance office with the documents they'd requested. I added nothing else, no interpretation, no commentary, just the sequence. Within the hour, they acknowledged receipt. They asked one more question. Had my mother approved these changes knowingly? I didn't answer that one. Not yet. That evening, my mother came over. She stood in the doorway, arms folded loosely, eyes scanning the papers spread across the table. I didn't invite her to sit. I let her choose. She did. "I'm getting calls," she said quietly, "from people I don't recognize." "Are they asking about documents?" I asked. She nodded. "They say it's routine. Routine is what truth looks like when it's handled properly." I slid a folder toward her, one she hadn't seen yet. Inside were copies of earlier trust drafts, ones that clearly named protections she'd never been told about. She read slowly, lips pressed together. "I don't remember signing away these safeguards," she said. "You didn't," I replied. "They were removed later." She looked up at me, eyes searching. "By Lawrence?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence between us felt different than it had at Christmas. It wasn't avoidance. It was recognition. On Thursday, Lawrence escalated. He sent an email to extended family framing the situation as confusion caused by grief. He wrote about how hard it had been to hold everything together. He mentioned my name once indirectly, suggesting I was struggling to let go. No one responded publicly, but 2 people forwarded it to me privately. That mattered more. On Friday morning, the compliance office requested a call. I accepted. They were careful, professional. They asked me to walk through the timeline, not emotionally, but structurally. Who held authority when? What approvals were documented? Where exceptions were made? When I finished, there was a pause. Then one of them said, "Thank you. This helps clarify scope." Scope is what comes before review. After the call, I sat quietly at the table and looked at the chair across from me. not the Christmas chair, the one in my apartment, worn and ordinary. I thought about how often Lawrence had relied on me staying seated somewhere else. That afternoon, the first formal notice went out. Not to me, to the company. A request for records, a deadline, a list of items too specific to be casual. Lawrence called again. This time, he sounded different. "People are asking questions," he said, "serious ones." "I know," I replied. "You didn't have to do this," he said. I stood by the window, watching the late sun stretch across the floor. "Yes," I said calmly, "I did." There was a long pause on the line. Then he said something quietly, almost to himself. "I thought you'd stay silent." I ended the call. By evening, I added a new line to my notes. External inquiry initiated. Nothing had collapsed yet, but the structure had been acknowledged. And once a system acknowledges something, it doesn't forget. The notice changed how people behaved. Not dramatically, but precisely. Emails grew shorter. Meetings gained agendas. Requests that once passed through Lawrence now arrived through shared inboxes with multiple names attached. The system was no longer assuming anything. It was verifying. On Monday morning, the records team in Tempe sent over a batch of archived files I hadn't requested. The email was polite, almost casual, but the attachment list was long. Someone had decided to err on the side of completeness. I opened the files one by one and watched the picture sharpen. Amendments stacked on amendments. Temporary authorizations that quietly became permanent. Notes that referenced approvals without attaching them. Lawrence's handwriting appeared nowhere. That wasn't an accident. People who move things quietly rarely leave fingerprints. They leave gaps and trust others to look away. By midday, the compliance office followed up with a second list, shorter, sharper. They wanted confirmation of authority for 3 specific changes made within a 90-day window after my father's death. Each item matched a document I'd flagged weeks earlier. I forwarded the question to my mother. She read it twice, then looked at me across the table. "I don't remember approving any of this." "Did Lawrence say you did?" I asked. She shook her head. "He said it was handled." That was his pattern. Handled meant decided. Decided meant irreversible. Irreversible meant no questions. On Tuesday, Lawrence tried to regain ground. He scheduled a meeting at the company, inviting department heads and framing it as a reassurance session. He spoke about stability, about not letting outside confusion distract from core operations. He reminded people of loyalty. The meeting notes were forwarded to me by someone who hadn't added a name. I didn't need it. The notes included a line I'd seen before, written in bold: "All communications to be routed through executive leadership." Leadership is another word people use when they want to narrow channels. That afternoon, a bank officer called my mother. Routine verification, they said. A standard check tied to governance changes. They needed confirmation on who held signing authority for several accounts. My mother put the call on speaker. When the officer asked for documentation, she didn't defer to Lawrence. She asked for time. After the call ended, she exhaled slowly. "I should have asked these questions earlier." "You're asking them now," I said. That evening, Lawrence came to my apartment. He didn't knock. He rang the bell once, then waited. When I opened the door, he looked composed, almost conciliatory. "We're overcomplicating this," he said. "You're letting procedures create problems that don't need to exist." "Procedures prevent problems," I replied. He smiled thinly. "They slow things down." "They reveal things," I said. He glanced at the table covered in files. "You think this makes you powerful?" "No," I said. "It makes me accurate." He sighed as if disappointed. "Your father trusted me." "He trusted systems," I replied. "You bypassed them." The smile faded. "You don't know how much I protected you," he said quietly. I held his gaze. "From what?" He didn't answer. He left a few minutes later without raising his voice, without making threats. He didn't need to. He still believed there was room to negotiate. There wasn't. On Wednesday morning, the compliance office requested an independent valuation of the company's assets, past and present. They asked for timelines, justifications, and correspondence tied to each shift. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was reconstruction. By Thursday, a vendor paused a shipment pending confirmation of payment routing. Another asked for escrow on future invoices. Small disruptions, individually reasonable, collectively impossible to ignore. Lawrence sent a message to the family chat asking for patience and discretion. No one responded. That silence wasn't fear. It was alignment. On Friday, my grandmother called. "I found one more thing," she said. She brought it over herself, an envelope yellowed at the edges, sealed and addressed to my mother. Inside was a notarized memo my father had written months before he died, outlining contingencies if asset protections were altered without consent. He'd anticipated resistance. He'd planned for it. My mother read it slowly, then pressed her palm flat against the table. "He knew," she said. "Yes," I replied. That night, I organized the final set of documents and created a new folder. Irregularities verified. I sent it to the compliance office without commentary. The acknowledgement came an hour later. "Thank you. This completes our preliminary review." Completes. As I closed my laptop, I thought again about the chair at Christmas, the ease with which it had been taken, the way no one had objected. Lawrence had believed authority lived in moments people accepted without protest. He hadn't understood that authority dissolves when facts begin to accumulate, and they had been accumulating for a long time. The tone shifted the moment the word preliminary disappeared. On Monday morning, the compliance office sent a short follow-up, not a question, a notice. They outlined next steps, expanded scope, external reviewers, and a timeline that no longer bent around convenience. Lawrence called within minutes. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail this time, his voice measured but tight. "Natalie, this has gone far enough. You're letting bureaucracy spiral into something it doesn't need to be. Bureaucracy is what people call structure when it stops favoring them. By midday, the bank requested temporary restrictions on certain accounts pending clarification. The message was polite. The effect was not. Lawrence's ability to move money unilaterally had narrowed to routine operations only, subject to review. He responded by calling a meeting. Not with me, with the company. An all hands framed as reassurance. Someone sent me the invite by mistake or intention. The subject line read, "Maintaining stability during review." Stability is another word people use when they mean control. I read the minutes afterward. Lawrence spoke for 30 minutes about continuity, about trust, about how outside scrutiny often misunderstood family businesses. He emphasized loyalty. He discouraged speculation. No questions were recorded. That silence felt different than the one at Christmas. This wasn't comfort. It was calculation. That afternoon, my mother received an email from Lawrence's attorney. It was careful, professional, and unmistakable. It suggested that ongoing inquiries could expose the family to unnecessary risk. It implied that discretion would be appreciated. It asked for a meeting. My mother didn't forward it to me. She brought her laptop instead. "I don't want to misunderstand this," she said, placing it on the table. "We read it together." "They're asking you to stop," I said. She nodded, without saying it. "Will you?" I asked. She closed the laptop. "No." That answer landed quietly, but it landed. On Tuesday, the independent reviewers arrived in Tempe. 2 firms, separate mandates, shared access. They didn't ask Lawrence to explain. They asked him to provide. They requested original authorizations, contemporaneous notes, correspondence that supported decisions made during the transition. He produced summaries. They asked for sources. By Wednesday morning, one of the reviewers requested a private call with me. They didn't accuse Lawrence. They didn't need to. They asked me to confirm sequence. Who knew what, when? What documentation existed before changes were implemented? Whether protections had been communicated to beneficiaries? "Some were," I said. "Some were removed." There was a pause. "Thank you," they replied. "That clarifies intent." Intent is a dangerous word when paired with documentation. That evening, Lawrence came to my apartment again. He didn't ring the bell this time. He knocked once, then waited. When I opened the door, he didn't smile. "You've made your point," he said. "Now let this end." I stepped aside just enough for him to see the table. Files stacked neatly, labeled, restrained. Not dramatic, not chaotic. "This ends when it's accurate," I replied. He exhaled sharply. "You think this makes you righteous?" "No," I said, "it makes this traceable." He looked past me as if searching for my mother. When he realized she wasn't there, his posture shifted. You don't know how exposed you are, he said. I met his eyes. Exposure isn't the same as vulnerability. He left without another word. On Thursday, the first external finding arrived. Not a conclusion, an observation. Certain asset movements lacked sufficient authorization. Certain restructurings deviated from standard governance following a death. Additional review recommended. Recommended is what happens before required. By Friday, vendors requested revised payment terms. Insurers asked for updated disclosures. A board advisor, someone my father had trusted years earlier, reached out and asked if I'd be willing to assist as a point of continuity. Quietly, I said. That's how this works, he replied. That night, my mother and I sat at the table without speaking for a long time. She finally broke the silence. I thought keeping peace meant staying still, she said. I didn't realize it meant shrinking you. I shook my head. You didn't shrink me. She looked relieved, then tired. I don't want him handling anything anymore, she said. He isn't, I replied. Saturday morning, the notice went out. Lawrence's operational authority was suspended pending review. Temporary, procedural, immediate. He sent one last message to the family chat. I hope one day you understand what you've done. No one replied. That silence wasn't fear. It was completion. I closed my laptop and backed up the files again, labeling a new folder Findings. Phase 1. The chair at Christmas came back to me, not as humiliation but as a hinge, a point where everything had pivoted without noise. Lawrence had believed silence was something he controlled. He hadn't understood that silence can also be preparation. And the preparation was finished. Lawrence didn't disappear after his authority was suspended. He adapted. That had always been his strength. Reading the room, adjusting the temperature, finding the path that looked reasonable enough to walk through without resistance. When control slipped from his hands, he shifted toward influence. On Monday morning, the first sign arrived quietly. An email circulated to senior staff, forwarded again and again until it reached me. It spoke about unity, about protecting the family legacy from misinterpretation. It suggested that outside reviewers didn't understand the nuances of a privately run business built on trust. Trust again. I noticed what the message didn't say. It didn't deny the findings. It didn't explain the missing authorizations. It didn't mention the documents. It framed the issue as tone, not fact. By noon, 2 employees reached out separately. Careful messages, respectful, asking whether it was safe to cooperate fully with reviewers or whether they should wait for guidance. That question alone told me everything. Lawrence wasn't trying to stop the process. He was trying to slow it. That afternoon, his attorney requested a formal meeting with the review teams, proposing mediation and confidentiality. The language was polished, almost generous. A chance to resolve concerns collaboratively. The response came back an hour later. The review would continue as scheduled. No mediation, no pause. Lawrence's next move was personal. He called my mother. She told me later how he'd framed it, how he said this was becoming dangerous, how reputations were fragile, how Natalie was being pulled into something irreversible. He said, "You're too close to this," she said softly. "And what did you say?" I asked. She looked at me, then down at her hands. I said, "You're the only one who's actually reading." That night, Lawrence showed up again. This time, he didn't knock or ring. He waited by the elevator as if coincidence might soften the encounter. When I stepped out, he straightened. "Natalie," he said, "we need to talk before this goes any further." "It already has," I replied. He lowered his voice. "You're letting outsiders define a family matter." "This stopped being a family matter when documents were altered," I said. He sighed, the sound practiced. "You don't know what you're risking." "I do," I answered. "I'm risking your version of things." His eyes hardened briefly. "You think this ends cleanly?" "No," I said. "I think it ends clearly." That was the moment he changed tactics. "Your father trusted me," he said again, slower this time. "He wouldn't want this." I met his gaze. "My father trusted systems. You avoided them." For a second, something flickered across his face. Not anger, not fear. Calculation. "You don't have proof of intent," he said. "You have assumptions." I shook my head. "I have sequence." "Sequence is what intent looks like when it's documented." He stepped back, nodding once, as if accepting something he'd already suspected. "Then you leave me no choice." "What choice?" I asked. He didn't answer. The next morning, the legal notice arrived. Not aggressive, strategic. It alleged unauthorized interference, breach of confidentiality, and reputational harm. It suggested that my cooperation with reviewers constituted overreach. It requested immediate cessation and threatened action if disruption continued. I read it once. Then I forwarded it to the reviewers, to the compliance office, and to the bank liaison overseeing the restrictions. No commentary, just context. By afternoon, the reply came. They acknowledged receipt. They asked for clarification on one point. Had Lawrence attempted to limit cooperation after his authority was suspended? I attached the email he'd sent staff. The response was immediate. "Thank you, that addresses our concern. Concern is what happens when patience ends." By Thursday, the scope expanded again. Additional entities were brought in. Tax specialists, governance advisors. The timeline widened. What had started as review became reconstruction. Lawrence was formally notified that all communication with reviewers would occur through counsel. He sent one final message to the family group chat. "This has gone too far. Some things can't be undone." No one replied. That silence wasn't loyalty. It was recognition. Friday evening, my mother and I sat together without papers between us for the first time in weeks. She looked older but steadier. "I thought silence was protection," she said. "I see now it was permission." I reached for her hand. "You didn't give permission forever." She nodded. That night, I organized the last of the files and created a final timeline. Clean, complete, unembellished. I titled it, "Control to Correction." The chair at Christmas came back to me again, not as a symbol of loss, but of exposure. The moment where Lawrence believed he was asserting authority. He hadn't realized he was revealing it instead. By the time I closed my laptop, the system no longer needed me to push. It was moving on its own. And Lawrence, for the first time, was reacting instead of deciding. The first consequence arrived without Lawrence's name on it. It came as a notice from a lender, brief, factual, and unmistakable. A routine adjustment, they said, pending review. Credit terms would be revised. Disbursements paused until governance questions were resolved. Routine. Lawrence called the lender within minutes. They declined to speak with him. By midday, 2 vendors requested escrow arrangements for future invoices. Another asked for written confirmation of payment authority before releasing inventory. None of them mentioned Lawrence directly. They didn't need to. Systems recognize patterns faster than people admit them. That afternoon, the interim governance advisor requested a meeting. Not with Lawrence, with me and my mother. We met in a neutral office downtown. Glass walls, soft light, no family photos. The advisor spoke carefully, explaining next steps, asset tracing, authority verification, and a formal recommendation to separate ownership from operational control until the review concluded. My mother listened without interrupting. When asked whether she agreed to proceed, she didn't look at me. She nodded. "Yes," she said, "I do." That single word closed a door Lawrence had relied on for years. On Wednesday morning, the company announced the appointment of a temporary administrator. The email was brief and procedural, emphasizing continuity and transparency. Lawrence's role was described in the past tense. He responded by sending messages, first to staff, then to family, framing the decision as overcorrection. He spoke about reputation, about how temporary measures could become permanent if misunderstood. No one echoed him. Silence this time wasn't caution. It was consensus. By Thursday, the findings expanded beyond governance. Tax specialists flagged discrepancies that required explanation, not accusations, questions, the kind that come with deadlines and forms attached. Lawrence's attorney requested an emergency call. It didn't happen. Instead, the advisor sent a single response. All communications would proceed through the established review channels. That evening, Lawrence came to my apartment for the last time. He didn't wait by the elevator. He didn't knock. He stood at the end of the hallway as if distance might make this easier. "You don't know what you've done," he said. "I do," I replied. "You've dismantled everything," he insisted. "No," I said, "I've separated it." He laughed once, hollow. "You think this makes you right?" "No," I said again, "it makes this traceable." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They'll come for everything." "They're already here," I replied. "They're just quiet about it." For the first time, he didn't argue. He looked tired, smaller, like a man discovering that influence doesn't survive documentation. "Your father never trusted you with this," he said finally. I held his gaze. "My father trusted structure. You tried to replace it." That was the moment he understood there would be no return. He left without another word. On Friday, the formal notice arrived. Lawrence's authority over all family assets was terminated pending final resolution. Access to accounts, records, and decision-making channels was revoked. The language was careful, conservative, and final enough to matter. My mother signed the acknowledgement without hesitation. Afterward, she sat quietly, hands folded, as if waiting for something to collapse inside her. It didn't. "I thought I'd feel guilty," she said. "I don't." "That's clarity," I replied. That night, I returned to the Christmas memory one last time. The chair, the hand on its back, the room that accepted the moment without resistance. Lawrence had believed power lived in gestures people didn't challenge. He hadn't understood that power dissolves when gestures are recorded, reviewed, and removed from context. By the end of the week, the review had a name, a scope, and a path forward. The administrator called it stabilization. I called it separation. And somewhere between the last email of the day and the quiet that followed, I realized something else. Lawrence hadn't lost because I spoke up. He lost because the silence he relied on stopped protecting him. And once silence withdraws its cover, there's nothing left to hide behind. The final phase didn't arrive as a confrontation. It arrived as confirmation. On Monday morning, the review team issued their interim findings: structured, footnoted, restrained. It wasn't a judgment. It didn't assign motive. It didn't speculate. It simply mapped what had happened, when it had happened, and under whose authority. Authority mattered now. The document was circulated to the board, the administrator, the bank, and my mother. Lawrence received it last, not as punishment, but as procedure. By noon, the bank finalized the separation of accounts. Ownership and operations were formally decoupled. Trust assets were restored to their original protective structures, pending final resolution. The language was careful, but the effect was decisive. Lawrence no longer had a role to contest. He called once. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, short and controlled. "You got what you wanted." I deleted it. What I wanted had never been about him. On Tuesday, the administrator requested my presence, not as an advocate, but as a witness to continuity. They asked questions about how things were supposed to work, how my father documented decisions, how accountability had been maintained before things quietly shifted. I answered with records. Facts don't exaggerate, they don't need to. That afternoon, my mother received a call from the attorney who had handled the original probate. He apologized, not emotionally, but professionally, for relying on representations that should have been verified independently. He outlined corrective steps. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for cooperation. She agreed. By Wednesday, the company released a brief statement acknowledging the transition and reaffirming governance standards. Employees responded with relief rather than fear. Productivity stabilized. Decisions slowed, then sharpened. Without interference, the system remembered itself. That evening, my mother and I walked through her house in Scottsdale, the one that still carried Lawrence's choices in its layout and silence. She stopped in the dining room and looked at the table. "I don't want this here anymore," she said. "You don't have to keep it," I replied. She nodded. "I know." The house would be sold, not in anger, in clarity. On Thursday, Lawrence's attorney sent one final message. It acknowledged the findings and confirmed compliance with all directives. There were no appeals, no conditions, just acceptance. It read like a surrender without apology. Friday came quietly. The administrator called to confirm final steps. Trust protections reinstated. Asset tracing complete. No further action required from me unless requested. "You were thorough," he said. "I was patient," I replied. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and packed away the folders I'd lived with for weeks. I didn't destroy them. I archived them. Properly, permanently. The way my father would have wanted. The chair at Christmas surfaced in my thoughts one last time. Not as loss, not as humiliation, as information. That moment had shown me exactly where authority was being assumed instead of earned, exactly how easily silence could be mistaken for consent. Lawrence had believed removing me from the table would preserve his position. He hadn't understood that it would expose it. On Sunday morning, I drove past the supply company in Tempe again. Trucks moved in steady rhythm. Employees greeted each other without watching their words. The temporary sign had been removed. The original name stood alone. Unembellished, accurate. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. The story had finished rearranging itself. Lawrence would live with the outcome quietly, not ruined, not redeemed, simply corrected, and I would move forward without carrying his version of things with me. Some endings arrive with noise. This one arrived with alignment. An alignment, once restored, doesn't ask permission to stay. The year changed without ceremony. No announcements marked the transition. No conversations circled back to explanations that had already been given. What had needed to be said was written down, verified, and placed where it belonged. In systems, not in people. By early spring, the trust protections my father had designed were fully reinstated, not rewritten, not improved, simply returned to their original intent: steady, patient, unambiguous. The supply company in Tempe moved forward under clear oversight, no longer shaped by improvisation or quiet exceptions. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like relief. My mother sold the house in Scottsdale a month later. She said she wanted fewer rooms, fewer memories that asked her to explain herself. She moved into a smaller place near the edge of town, somewhere light reached the windows earlier in the day. We didn't talk about Lawrence much. There was nothing left to say. I stayed involved with the company, but not visibly. Advisory, not symbolic. I attended meetings where documentation mattered more than personalities, where questions were welcomed instead of deferred. People listened. Not because of what had happened, but because clarity had become the rule again. On the first Christmas after everything, we didn't recreate the old gathering. There was no long table, no assigned seats. My mother cooked quietly. We ate in the kitchen, passing plates, pausing when we needed to. When she hesitated before sitting, I pulled out a chair beside mine without comment. She smiled. That was enough. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the house settled into its new rhythm, I stood alone for a moment and thought about the night that had started it all. The hand on the back of the chair, the sentence spoken calmly, the room that accepted it without question. I understood something then that I hadn't fully grasped before. That moment hadn't taken anything from me. It had revealed what had already been taken quietly over time. And it had revealed something else, too. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's observation. Sometimes it's preparation. My father had known that. He hadn't raised his voice when he planned. He hadn't confronted without structure. He'd trusted that systems, once respected, would outlast any single person trying to bend them. He'd been right. Lawrence had believed power lived in comfort. In moments no one challenged because it was easier not to. He'd mistaken my quiet for permission, my patience for absence. He hadn't understood that patience can be active, that it can be collecting, recording, waiting. On New Year's morning, I drove past the warehouse one last time before work. The docks were quiet, the air cool, the day untouched. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. The story no longer lived there. It lived where it always had, in the space between structure and integrity, where things are meant to rest once they're returned to their proper place. Lawrence had taken my seat, my inheritance, and my silence, because he believed those things could be reassigned. What he hadn't understood was that none of them were his to give back. They were never taken from me. They were simply waiting, patiently, for the moment when balance was ready to return.